Hello, I am Professor 8-Bit.
Vanguard sent the beat, Galaxian. Now where you been? You'll make the days roll on by, blasting bugs out of the sky. Well, you know deep down that it's gonna be a hummer, 'cause nobody's harder than Atari this summer. Nobody's harder than Atari this summer.
This summer, the really hot video games come from Atari. We've got Centipede, Ms. Pac-Man, Vanguard, and Galaxian. If you thought it was going to be just another summer, Atari is going to turn your head around.
The hot names, the hot games, the hot deals. Yeah, it's gonna be a hummer, 'cause nobody's harder than Atari this summer. Nobody's harder than Atari this summer.
After the success of Atari 2600, the Atari 5200 was released in 1982. The system appeared to have lots of potential for previous Atari gamers, except there was a few flaws that prevented them from investing in the Atari 5200. The most common flaw with the console was that the joystick controller was absolutely terrible. The analog joystick wasn't even centered correctly. It was a very sloppy design, causing it to break easily as well. The controller appears to have issues with certain games on the Atari 5200, to the point of where you would probably regret buying an Atari 5200. The next issue with the 5200 is a huge mistake on Atari's part. For some reason, the 5200 was designed with no backwards capability, with the much more successful 2600 games.
If you think ColecoVision plays all Atari cartridges,
You mean it can't?
here's Pac-Man on ColecoVision. But here's Pac-Man for the Atari 5200 Super System.
Now you're talking.
And it doesn't work on ColecoVision.
But won't their adapter?
It won't play Super System cartridges.
Not pole position?
Not this pole position.
Not centipede?
Not this centipede. Only on the Atari 5200 Super System.
But aren't they hard to find?
They're everywhere.
Everywhere?
The Atari 5200 Super System.
For this reason alone, some Atari gamers probably decided to keep their distances from the Atari 5200. To also add insult to injury, the console's power supply was absolutely huge for the time, and the RF switch was confusing for some people.
Don Mallard, captain of the U.S. video game team.
When I'm not going for high scores in the arcades, I'm home playing games on my Atari 7800. As an expert, I like the 7800 because there are great arcade hits like Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong Jr., adventure games like Impossible Mission, sports games like Hat Trick and Real Sports Baseball, action games like Desert Falcon and Karateka, and the 7800 plays all the 2600 games. As a consumer, I like the 7800 because most games cost under $20.
The Atari 7800, the choice of the experts.
The Atari 7800 was one of Atari's last attempts at a home video game console. There was still a market for those gamers who may not really like the NES or Sega Master System, but instead were huge fans of the space video games that they were accustomed to. On the 2600, the Atari 7800 was capable of playing Atari 2600 games, which was a plus for Atari gamers. Unfortunately, Atari rushed the Atari 7800 to the market, and they left out the much-improved sound chip, known as Gumby. Instead, they continued to use the old Atari 2600 sound chip, known as Bokeh. To make it even more flawed, Atari decided to add a few last-minute designs to the 7800, allowing developers to add their own sound chip into the gaming cartridges in order to improve sound quality.
With be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System? The one to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot, batteries not included. He helps you tackle even the toughest challenge. Will you be the first to raise the incredibly accurate Zapper and play games like Duck Hunt or action-packed Hogan's Alley and high-flying Kung Fu, each sold separately? Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System? Comes with Rob, Zapper, Control Deck, 2 controllers, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt.
The Nintendo Entertainment System was one of the greatest consoles of all time. Released after the video game crash of 1984, the NES contributed to bringing the video game market back to life. Despite the NES being so highly successful, there was a few flaws that plagued every single NES. The American NES was designed specifically to be completely different than any other console that had been released prior to the NES in North America. First of all, the NES had a D-pad, which was a new concept. Secondly, the NES had a front-loading design that was completely unique, never seen before in any other video game system. It resembled a VCR and had a front-opening door that opened similar to the DeLorean sports car. The design was appealing to the eye, but after a long period of time, it became a huge major flaw because the NES will freeze and blank before the game begins, causing NES gamers to replace the pins inside their console after a long period of time. The NES also contained a chip known as the 10NES. Its objective was to lock out anything that was not officially authentic. Unfortunately, this chip occasionally interfered with authentic NES games, which resulted with a blinking red light, and meanwhile, you have a game that refuses to play.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo, New Super Mario World, created especially for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It's a bit more exciting, a bit more challenging, a bit more graphic, a bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get New Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The Super Nintendo was a 16-bit masterpiece. You may have a hard time trying to find out why such a perfect gaming console is being mentioned. A portion of the SNES consoles had one flaw in particular. There was an unknown chemical in the plastic casing of the SNES. If it was exposed to oxygen long enough, your Super Nintendo could possibly turn yellow. Rumor has it, the amount of chemical used in different batches of the plastic was different, which explains why some SNES are yellow, and some are simply perfect. The CPU was also flawed. The Super Nintendo suffered from slowdowns during gameplay. The SNES was not capable of as much on-screen animation as Sega Genesis was. Sega Genesis had blast processing.
Gotta go. Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow! What's this one? Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
But kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis. It's a whole lot more for less.
Sega Genesis seemed like the perfect 16-bit game system. However, the first model, Sega Genesis, suffered from a visual flaw known as rainbow banding.
Jaguar by Atari is the only video game system with 64 bits of awesome power. This irresponsible action into the living room of our young people.
Get bit by Jaguar.
Speaking of Atari, their very last home gaming console was the Jaguar. There is a couple reasons why this was Atari's very last gaming console, but before we mention those reasons, let's first mention that the Atari Jaguar was a very powerful gaming console.
Some of you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe. Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits. 3DO is 32 bits. The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! 16 and 32 are less than 64. So with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
It was specifically designed to kill the SNES and Sega Genesis with its far more powerful technology, enabling it to easily play 3D polygon games. The Atari Jaguar was billed as a 64-bit console due to its complex multi-processing technology. Atari truly had a nice piece of technology, but what was so flawed about the Atari Jaguar? Let's take a look. Atari had very bad support from developers on the Atari Jaguar. There was plenty of games releasing on those 16-bit consoles that was not releasing on Atari Jaguar, and that caused gamers to choose Genesis or SNES instead of the Jaguar. If Atari had better support, who knows, the Jaguar might have kicked ass, big time, but they still had a few other flaws. Atari had hardly any first-party games. They had a few, but they really didn't have enough to compete against Sonic the Hedgehog and Super Mario. Most people who would walk into a retailer and saw Sonic and Mario, and then saw Tempest 2000 side by side, would probably avoid Tempest due to its ugly box art, despite it being such a great game. Last but not least, the Atari Jaguar controller was far from perfect. The controller was literally the 90s version of the original Xbox controller. It was big and obnoxious. Also, the Atari Jaguar had so much power that every single game released for the system never actually tapped into the actual power that the system was capable of.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
Another Nintendo console that wasn't so lucky would have to be the Virtual Boy. This is probably one of the most awkward video game consoles of all time. Some people would call this console portable, while some people argue that it's not portable. In the mid-90s, 3D technology was a hot topic amongst the gaming community because we had Atari, Sega, and Nintendo experimenting with 3D technology. There was plenty of potential, but everything played out as if it was a race to the finish. Unfortunately, Nintendo finished first and released their Virtual Boy, and it only lasted about 6 months before it was no longer sold anymore, which is crazy. So why the hell did it have such a short lifespan? Well, as mentioned before, this thing was awkward, and gamers could not decide whether it was a portable or regular gaming console. It was literally a huge pair of goggles with 2 legs with a controller attached to it. You really couldn't position the Virtual Boy system to suit your comfort, but instead, you had to hunch your back over and stand that position in order to play the game for a long period of time. Meanwhile, the biggest flaw with the console was that for some reason, it caused headaches and also interfered with epilepsy, causing people to have seizures. This obviously became a major health concern, and Nintendo did not want any bad publicity, which is probably why the system died off so fast. Rumor has it, the Sega VR was also scrapped because Sega did not want anyone walking out into traffic by accident, which is probably an excuse. The true reason was probably the Virtual Boy's failure.
You know who lives in control. You know who has 4 times the action. You know who feels the freedom. You know who breaks the barriers. You know who stands out from the crowd. You know who everybody's after. You know who. The games of Nintendo 64. Get mad or get out.
Around the time that CD technology became mainstream and fairly stable to use, Nintendo decided not to use CD technology for their new console, Nintendo 64. This was considered a huge flaw for the most part, but Nintendo gamers still purchased the console and remained loyal to Nintendo. Why exactly did Nintendo rebel against CD technology? During the Super Nintendo's life cycle, Sega released Sega CD, a CD attachment for the Sega Genesis. Nintendo had been slightly interested in doing the same thing, and at the time, Sony was partnered with Nintendo. Sony supplied the sound chips for the Super Nintendo, and was encouraging Nintendo to okay the CD attachment, but there was only one problem. The console attachment, codenamed PlayStation, has a catch-22. Deep down inside that contract with Nintendo, Sony had planned to release their very own standalone version of the PlayStation, allowing it to play Super Nintendo games. As soon as Nintendo saw that, they opted out of the whole idea. After breaking their relationship with Sony, Nintendo decided to give Philips a chance, to the point of where they released a standalone CD console of their own. It wasn't able to play SNES games, nor was it attached to the SNES. Nintendo was still a little shaky with CD technology. Well, Nintendo allowed some of their top-known mascots, Mario and Zelda, to be used in a few Philips CDI video games. The results were disastrous. The games completely sucked. Nintendo did not want anything to do with the technology and refused to use it in the Nintendo 64. Some games ended up being better on the N64 using the old cartridge format, while some games suffered.
Non lassù, non qua giù, non siamo svegli, non altrove, dormiamo.
Welcome to the third place.
Around when the PlayStation 2 first arrived in 2000, there was plenty of excitement about this console. Many gamers purchased it, took the console home, began to play it, and noticed that their PS2 had a discrete error, and it wasn't so exciting anymore. The first generation PS2s were plagued with this flaw, because of possibly using cheap DVD drives. DVD technology was fairly new at the time, and became mainstream, so the DVD drives, at the time, were not nearly as efficient as what we have today. In fact, this may be the reason Sega decided to not use DVD technology for the Dreamcast. At the time, regular CD technology was very stable, and DVD technology obviously was not. Many people claim that this is a flaw in the Dreamcast. However, DVD technology became a flaw in the PS2.
And from the far corners of the earth, so shall the multitude be joined together, and their power will be magnificent to behold.
The original Xbox, released in 2001, made its way into the gaming industry with a handful of good games to play, such as Halo, Project Gotham Racing, Fusion Frenzy, and even Sega began making games for it as well. Seems perfect at first glance, but there was quite a few flaws with this one. The first flaw would have to be the DVD drive. It seems that Microsoft had the cheapest, crappiest DVD drive placed inside the original Xbox consoles, and after a while, they didn't treat discs too well at all. The Xbox DVD drive was temperature sensitive. If you stored your games in a cold environment, the Xbox drive will usually have issues reading the disc. The last flaw was the original Xbox controllers. They were okay with playing shooting games like Halo, but they were not okay playing anything else. Gamers were complaining about them and criticizing them. Well, Microsoft decided to redesign the Xbox controller. At least 25% of the original Xbox sales are probably from people who were forced to buy another Xbox due to flaws, and Microsoft made a huge profit from these flaws.
You are the colony. You found your way to the center, and you're in control. This experience revolves around you.
Welcome to Xbox 360.
While the original Xbox had its fair share of flaws, you would imagine that Microsoft would learn from their mistakes. The Xbox 360 released in 2005. It became highly successful in comparison to the first Xbox. But did Microsoft finally manufacture a flawless video game console? Absolutely not. In fact, for the first time ever, Microsoft turned a flaw into a feature integrated into the actual console. The Red Ring of Death became a household name for gamers who can relate to current generation gaming. There was many flaws that could trigger the Red Ring of Death. In fact, it seems that the Xbox 360 was even more flawed than the previous Xbox video game console. At one point, the failure rate was at an all-time high of 54%. Due to crappy warranties, most Xbox 360 gamers have already purchased their second and even third Xbox 360 console, causing the Xbox 360 to sell much more than it would if it was not flawed.
Play Beyond.
The PlayStation 3 released in 2006 and became one of the great first-generation HD consoles. The PlayStation 3 for the most part is a great gaming console, but there was a few flaws with this console. Let's take a look. The obvious flaw was the original 6-axis controller. There really wasn't anything wrong with the controller, but there was something missing. The rumble feature that you would normally find in PlayStation 2, and even PlayStation 1 games, was missing in this PS3 controller. I remember the Xbox fanatics poking fun at the PlayStation 3 for this reason, and it was a troll fest, but later on, Sony released the real deal, the DualShock 3 PS3 controller with rumble. Everyone who had a 6-axis was screwed. They were forced to go out and buy new controllers in order to have rumble feature. While the controller was an issue to some gamers, a more serious internal heating problem plagued the PlayStation 3. This flaw caused the yellow light of death. While the PS3 was probably the best designed HD console for the time, I would point all the current increases in flawed gaming on manufacturing the consoles in China. If you decide to manufacture your console in a cheap Chinese facility, I would imagine that the failure rate will rise due to the careless quality and the fast production methods used to manufacture these gaming consoles.